We got Brian in Houston, Texas. Thanks for waiting.
Hey, how are y'all doing?
Good,
Pretty
thank
good.
you.
Matt, I hope you feel better soon. I wanted to ask
Thanks.
you about your response to the fine-tuning argument. So, in your debate with Blake Genta...
Yeah, you emailed me
you
today or yesterday, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, so you give Blake 13 cards, and they all turn up to be spades, and you say, on the hypothesis that you had cheated, that would be more likely.
Mm-hmm.
And Blake agrees and says, he says that's evidence that you're cheating, but not proof. And you agree, you say, we haven't determined anything about whether or not I actually cheated, but it's more likely on the hypothesis that I did cheat. So my question is, if you're going to argue that fine-tuning is analogous to the deck of cards, and then say, but with the deck of cards, you know, if you have 13 spades and things line up like that, but that's evidence of cheating, if the two things are analogous, then doesn't that imply that with the fine-tuning, you also think that's evidence of cheating or agency intervention? You might not think it's conclusive proof, but wouldn't that be evidence?
Well, yes, but there's a couple things that are different. First of all, evidence for a proposition is separate from sufficient evidence to warrant a conclusion. So you can have one little piece of evidence that would be consistent with a hypothesis, but that is not enough to conclude reasonably that hypothesis is the most likely answer. In the case of the cards, we're looking at an outcome that we are attributing significance to. And in the case of the universe, we are doing the same thing. Right. We are this universe is significant because it's important to us. There's nothing about it that is intrinsically significant. And when we look around and we see what appears to be design, we are making a conclusion about what the likely explanation for the appearance of design. But the appearance of design is not necessarily design. And things can appear designed when they're not. And this is where it differs from the cards. Obviously, if I'm dealing out cards in front of somebody, we know that there's an agent involved who is capable. We don't know that for the universe. So like any other analogy, it's going to fall apart at some point. The purpose was to show that just because we find a significant result and we see the appearance of design that might make people suspicious about design, that does not mean that we have sufficient evidence to conclude that design is the most likely answer.
I have a question.
Okay, so I mean...
Can I just ask a question? Actually, it's a question for Matt, because I'm not familiar with the context of the example that you're giving, so I just have a quick question for Matt.
Sure.
So, let's say that I have a deck of cards and Matt has a deck of cards. We each have a full deck. And I deal out 13 random cards out of my deck. And then Matt has to deal 13 cards out of his deck. Even though my 13 cards are random, wouldn't it be just as significant if he dealt 13 random cards that matched my cards? And they wouldn't be all spades, they'd just be random cards. But wouldn't it be amazing if he just started turning his cards and it turned out to be the same exact cards I had just turned?
Right, and in that example, I mean, I would agree that it's likely that Matt had prearranged the deck.
Right, but here's my thing. What if I didn't have a deck and I didn't put those cards down and Matt put down his cards and rolled out 13 random cards?
So I guess I'm confused. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm saying if I had put the cards down first and he had matched them, we would all be amazed. But if he had laid that same line of cards, but I had never laid any cards, we would just say that's just 13 random cards. Right? Even if it was the same lineup of cards that we had in the first example. So the idea is
improbable that he would have the same 13 cards that you had laid out.
Right, but he could lay those same 13 cards on another day when I'm not around and nobody's.
They would be just as improbable.
Just 13.
Is that what you're arguing?
Well, I'm saying that any 13 cards are going to be just as the odds would be the same, whether they're spades or not spades.
No, I understand. I think I understand. So my point isn't that the constants are just unlikely. What we're concerned about is what results from the constants. So, we can have 13 cards, but they just sit there and don't do anything. But when we adjust the constants, it's not like we have kind of the same big macroscopic picture where things just vary slightly. So we might have, different types of stars or planets or intelligent life. But things become pretty catastrophic. I mean, like if we adjust...
In some cases. I mean,
I would argue in most cases...
Okay, in most cases.
But it's still, what difference does it make?
Maybe this is the absolute only configuration of those constants that results in anything significant. That still doesn't tell you that it was fine-tuned. Let's say a billion different universes attempt to form over and over and over again. If this is the only one that could produce
what got produced,
then it's the only one that would ever recognize that it's the only one that could do this. And that doesn't tell, the fact of its improbability doesn't tell you how it came about. And unless you can demonstrate some agent capable of doing this, you don't get to just make one up.
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I would kind of get into the intrinsic probabilities of theism, but I think the issue there would be not that we're just inferring design arbitrarily, but saying, okay, is this plausibly due to necessity? And then, I mean, it doesn't seem like anyone in mainstream physics thinks that the constants are necessary. I think Paul Davies said that there's no reason to think that that's the case. But then, I mean, it seems highly also implausible that it's due to chance as well.
Is it the consensus of physicists that an intelligent designer is behind our universe?
No, and I'm not saying that because physicists don't believe in God, or I'm not trying to argue from authority. I'm just trying to say if we can reasonably eliminate necessity and chance, and those are the only two naturalistic alternatives, then I guess I don't see how design...
How did you eliminate chance?
By its own right is that, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
How did you eliminate chance? It just seems unlikely?
Well, I mean,
isn't that what chance is?
Well, in your example, though, you said if you had 13 spades and they lined up, that it's more likely that there was cheating involved.
Yes,
right?
but the only reason we can say that for a deck of cards is because we know there is an agent here who is capable of cheating. So that now we have absolutely concrete confirmation that this is a possible explanation. You don't have that for the universe. You can't adjust any of the constants. You don't have any other universe to experiment with. It is all speculative. And to say that, it just seems unlikely. That to imply that the mere impression that it is incredibly unlikely is sufficient to conclude that there is an agent which we can't demonstrate that is necessary and sufficient or a more probable explanation. I mean, that's just bizarre to me. What
I don't know.
What keeps us from saying that it's not more plausible that universe-creating pixies are the explanation?
I just want to throw in, I don't know if my point is completely non-important or if it's not being understood. Because it could be that I'm not understanding something. But what I'm trying to say, no, not with you. I mean, I just think all around in the conversation, I'm wondering if I'm missing something or if everyone else is missing something here. But what I'm looking at, and the reason I gave the example I gave, was to say, if you come into it with an expectation of what it's supposed to be, then you are more likely to think someone cheated. If you come into it acknowledging that there is no expectation of what it's supposed to be, then whatever you turn over is like random. You're just going to see it as that's what I turned over. And so when we get a universe where anything happens, like whatever happens, the only reason that it could possibly be significant is if there's an expectation that it was supposed to be this way. And there, as far as I know, is no evidence that this was like mapped. There's no blueprint that I'm aware of that shows what the universe was supposed to be before it formed.
That's something we skipped over. That was the point of the analogy that I used during the debate, was to show that it's only significant because we imbue it with significance ahead of time.
Right. If you think it's supposed to be this way or that it was supposed to be this way, then of course you're going to think that this is like what it was supposed to be. But there's no reason to think it was supposed to be what it currently is.
And even if we were to conclude that it couldn't possibly have been anything else, that this is this is a necessary universe, That doesn't tell us anything about how or why. And if we were to conclude that it's a chance universe, that doesn't tell us anything about how or why.
Maybe we're a mistake and it was supposed to be catastrophic.
Okay, so I guess it sounds like you're kind of saying there's no reason to go ahead and like start at the table with assigning significance to our current universe, correct?
Yeah,
Correct.
because that injects a bias that affects the conclusions you're likely to get.
There's a big difference between shooting an arrow at a target on a tree and shooting an arrow and hitting a tree and then going and painting a target around it, right? That's an example that's been used before, but do you understand the difference there? So if you just shoot a random arrow and then go paint a target, it's not amazing that you hit the target.
Sure. So I guess I just don't think it's that unreasonable to like be concerned or curious about what parameters are necessary for us to exist. I mean,
no, I think a lot of people are looking into that, actually. I think that's like a fair thing for science to be examining.
So then I guess I don't understand the point about why it would be unreasonable for me to assign significance to the universe. I mean,
it's not. The idea is that you're assigning significance as though people were supposed to be a result of it, and that's the part where you're not showing your work.
It's significant to us. Okay. It is not significant intrinsically. It's like, I have a new truck. It's incredibly significant to me. It's meaningless to you.
Or here's an example.
Or it doesn't have value to
I have
you.
a cat, right? Is the product of the universe potentially cats? Like, is it possible that cats were the purpose of the universe? That one day we would be a conduit to produce domestic felines, and that's what was, desired.
My wife is nodding and saying, yes, that is in fact the purpose of the universe.
I mean, the idea that human beings are somehow the point of the universe is a really...
Right.
What Matt is saying is it may be a perspective that makes sense if you're one of the human beings, but there's a lot of things this universe does, and if you're going to say that something about it was preordained, why not one of those other billion things that it does?
Yeah, and I think Stephen Hawking said if the universe is fine-tuned for anything, it's fine-tuned for the creation of black holes.
Yeah, like destruction and vacuums.
Right,
yeah.
Sure. So I think... I hope I didn't give off the impression that that's kind of the dichotomy I'm painting, that either the universe exists solely for the purpose of human beings or it has no purpose at all. I mean, I think the universe could have a multitude of reasons, as you just mentioned, for existing. And humans are just one point of that. The point of the fine-tuning argument is the existence of things, not only humans, but like planets and stars and any kind of recognizable universe that we're familiar with, is vastly improbable. So we should expect a universe that Luke Barnes has described it as something sterile, lifeless, and featureless.
Except that there would be nobody there to observe that and recognize it. Okay, if there are thinking beings existing, then we are necessarily in a universe that supports thinking beings. And so it should be completely unremarkable as thinking beings that we find ourselves in a universe that supports thinking beings. It's wholly unremarkable.
Yeah. Even the catastrophic universe would be as unique. That would have its own unique parameters as well.
If we found ourselves in a universe that couldn't support human life, now that would be...
that would be more remarkable, right? Yeah. Well, that kind of sounds like the anthropic principle. And again, Luke Barnes has said something along the lines of, when we examine stars and the reasons they burn, the answer to that is because of nuclear reactions happening inside the stars. The answer is not because otherwise we wouldn't see them.
Right.
Right. And here's something interesting. When you have little children, they tend to assign agency to things that don't have agency. If you ask them questions like, why do birds sing? They will say, because it sounds pretty, right? Like they think it applies to them, so that they interpret things as behaving toward them. And even something like a door shutting on their hand, they will say, like, it bit me. Or
although, birds would be agents, doors aren't.
Right, but it's still, what I'm saying is they interpret these things as being for their benefit. Right? Like it's done for them or done to them.
Although we might be moving off to the side of Brian's point. So
okay.
I want to see if we can put a bow on this.
Yeah, so I guess my point, it sounds like we're kind of in agreement. I mean, that, like, it's not, I'm not arguing that it's a necessary component of the fine-tuning argument that humans be the sole reason for the universe. I know I already mentioned that. And I'm not trying to like assign significance just because, as humans, we feel that our lives have value. So that's kind of what we need to do in order to, I guess, just get on with our lives. But I think all I'm trying to do is examine each possibility.
Well, this is the problem then, Brian. Let's imagine we have a mystery, and we want to list the possible solutions to that mystery. When it comes to, I dealt out some cards, one of the possible solutions we know is possible is that I cheated. When it comes to the universe, what are the known possible explanations for the universe? There may in fact be none. But if we have no justification for saying that a God, an agent, is possible, then we don't get to include it in the list of possible explanations. And until we can demonstrate that our proposed solution is possible, it's not a solution at all.
So I guess, I can agree with that, but I guess I am under the impression that most people think theism is at least possible.
I think that most people probably haven't thought about this. But the fact that it's not demonstrably impossible does not mean that it's possible. This is something Blake and I went over and over again. Blake's position is that if you can't show it's impossible, then it is in fact possible. And my position is that possible and impossible are both assertions that need to be demonstrated, just like guilt and innocence. And you're not guilty just because we can't prove that you're innocent, and you're not innocent just because we can't prove that you're guilty, because what we can demonstrate is separate from what is. And so it may be the case that theism is impossible, but we can't demonstrate that. It may be the case that theism is possible, but we can't demonstrate that. But the null hypothesis puts us on the side of this is not the case until such time as it's demonstrated.
Okay, but I mean, people have tried offering plenty of philosophical arguments for why theism should be considered possible. I mean, I guess you're just saying that you don't find those persuasive, which is fine, and I'd be interested to hear your reasons for thinking that. But
because they all ultimately boil down. They all ultimately boil down to you can't prove that it's impossible.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of times they're just trying to draw an inference. For example, the cosmological argument, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think the point of it is to infer something beyond the universe, had to bring it into existence. And we're not necessarily at a God yet, but once we can begin to give the attributes that this thing must have, for example, it must be timeless, immaterial.
None of that is part of the cosmological argument.
Well, I mean, that's how it's used, like when William Lane Craig uses that argument.
I know. William Lane Craig uses it in a dishonest fashion, because the Kalam cosmological argument begins with everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Sure. Therefore, the universe had a cause for its existence. There's nothing in there about God or timeless or anything. The whole thing is there must be an explanation for the reason the universe began to exist. That's it. Doesn't tell us any characteristic about that. That's all something that Craig and others add in after the fact, sometimes using other arguments, sometimes just asserting it and saying, I don't have time to go through it.
Well, so I mean, if both of those premises were correct, like the universe began to exist, and I mean that would imply that space, time, and matter are finite. I guess I don't understand why it would be intrinsically unreasonable to say, okay, well, if space, time, and matter came into existence at a finite point in the past, that whatever brought them into existence cannot also have those attributes.
So first of all, the first two premises are not necessarily sound. There are physicists who object to them, and this is something that Sean Carroll pointed out in his debate with William Lane Craig by having Alan Bluth hold up a piece of paper that says, we don't know whether or not the universe, and by that we're talking the cosmos, not just our local presentation. We don't know if it's eternal, but he suspects that it is eternal. So what we have is, at best, an unknown premise, which makes the conclusion unresolved. Now, the thing is, even if the two premises were true, the only thing you have is our local presentation of the universe, our local space-time thing, has a point in the past where it came to be. But if time,
the argument's kind of...
if time is part of that, then it's absurd, nonsensical to talk about before that, because there's no time. It's also nonsensical to talk about something that exists absent time, because existence is temporal. And I don't know that we have any way to find that answer. And I find this is curious because I'm sure there are people out there, and you may or may not be one of them, who are convinced that some God exists and started it off, but they don't know much about him. They're not advocating for Christianity or Islam or whatever. But the whole point, the whole reason people are engaged in this exercise of let's see if we can find an argument that gets us to God is because they already believe in a specific God, which is how Craig goes from the Kalam to a classical theistic God to Jesus without actually connecting the dots very well. And if he didn't begin with this need to justify his belief in Jesus, would he cling on to the Kalam as if it were something that was going to demonstrate a God when it doesn't?
Well, I mean, I think you would have to ask him that, but I agree with you that
I'd like to.
That kind of chronology of argument is kind of, I think it's kind of poor. I mean, I don't think that like a teleological argument, I'm a Christian, but I don't think a teleological argument or a Kalam argument gets you to Jesus. I don't think it gets you to Christianity, but I think it's a good way. Like, I think if you were a homicide detective and you arrived at the scene, it would be important to establish that a murder had taken place before you tried to say, okay, this murder was committed by John.
Yeah.
So I think the argument.
I completely agree with that, by the way.
Creator exists.
I completely agree with that. And that's my problem is the people who are offering up theological explanations for the origin of the universe or whatever, pick your poison, have not even demonstrated that a murder took place. This is why, and Tracy and I remember a lunch we had ages ago where we came up with the courtroom analogy, and I've expanded and used it and everything else. I don't even think that the prosecutor has cause to bring the case before the court. You need probable cause. You need a good reason to think that you could begin to make a case. And I don't see that theism has done that.
Okay. Well, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of possibilities because
how do you know
the universe is eternal? Well, I mean,
sure, the universe is eternal or it's not.
Sure. I mean, if it came into existence out of nothing, like in his book Why I Became an Atheist, John Loftus says he says that the naturalist maintains that the universe either came into existence out of nothing, is self-caused, which doesn't make sense because it would have to exist before it existed. It's always existed, or it just arises as kind of a natural brute fact. But to me, I think the naturalist position, it ultimately rests upon there being some kind of brute fact of existence, like something that just exists inexplicably. Because, I mean, I think you even agreed with Blake that we can't really have an infinite regression. We ultimately have to have some kind of foundation that doesn't have anything more foundational than itself, but it does in fact exist.
I don't know for sure if there could be an infinite regress, but here's the thing. What's wrong, and I don't want to confuse terms, so for universe, I tend to refer to our local space-time tracing back to Big Bang, and then
Big Bang, right.
Cosmos would be everything that has ever existed or will ever exist, and it could be that it's a multiverse popping up universes or whatever. Why is it not the case that existence is just necessary and that a cosmos has always existed?
Well, I mean, I think for the mere fact that we can imagine it having not existed, I think that seems to me to be sufficient enough for.
I can definitely conceive of what's currently here not having always existed. But I actually have expressed problems with the idea of non-existence existing. That the idea that there was a point without existence, I can't conceive of that because in my mind, that's an incoherent concept. Like to say that non-existence existed, I don't know how to conceptualize that.
Not only that, the mere fact that we can conceive of something not existing doesn't tell us whether or not that's possible. I mean,
I think that
it may be a trick of language because I'm with Tracy.
It wouldn't, if it existed, then it wasn't non-existence.
It's not like there's a nothing that you could act upon. I can't even imagine a nothing.
Right. What would it be? You can't even ask what would it be because it wouldn't be. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know how to. I start really losing it when I start trying to conceptualize.
It's like talking about something existing outside of time.
Because it can't be.
But in either case, the mere fact that we can conceive of something doesn't tell us whether or not it's likely.
So are you arguing that like an actual nothingness, no space, no time, no quantum vacuum?
That almost seems like something.
Are you saying that
I mean, you just gave you just gave parameters, so that's something. I mean, nothing wouldn't even be descriptive.
Those were examples. I was giving examples of something, not what I would consider nothing. Because you have
that would be something.
Lawrence Krauss and Victor Stenger who say. They say nothing is unstable, but what they're referring to is actually the quantum vacuum. But
yeah, Lawrence and I talked about
which is something, vacuum, right?
Yeah, that's something.
Yeah,
it's not nothing.
Yeah.
Properties that can cause something.
Right.
What physicists have referred to as nothing is not the same as what philosophers have referred to as nothing. But the thing that philosophers have referred to as nothing, Tracy's saying, and I am pretty much in agreement. I can't conceive of that. I mean,
I don't know what you can't even ask what I can't even if I say I don't know what it would be. That statement makes no sense because if you could apply the to be verbs to it, it wouldn't be the non-existent thing or the nothing. So there's no way to even discuss it in a coherent way that I'm aware of.
Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. So I guess my question then is since we can't really, it's unreasonable to say that nothing existed and then something began existing, if you don't like the temporal phrasing of began, you could say, I don't really know.
Well, there was, but we can't say even based on our current models, there was never a time when something didn't exist.
So is that you're referring to current inflationary models, or?
Well, even in our local time, in what we perceive as time here, if the model shows that time began with the Big Bang, then there was never a time when something didn't exist. But you can expand that out to the cosmos, and excluding our universe, just talking about the cosmos. That's still something that exists, and I find no reason to think, and in agreement with other physicists, that it's not in fact eternal. So you would need to show that that can't be eternal, and I don't know how you would do that, in order to talk about that as a beginning, which is yet another problem. But here's the thing, and I don't mean to, I promise I'm not trying to do anything weird or tricky or insulting, but we're going to move on to other callers here in a minute. But you're a Christian.
Correct.
I was for many years, as was Tracy, and all these interesting philosophical arguments for the existence of God. The God that I believed in was real, and he had a plan, and he loved us, and he created the universe, and he sent his son to die for our sins, and blah, 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 blah. How does that make sense if we can't reasonably demonstrate that he actually exists? We want to know what's a plausible explanation for the universe. And theists or Christians, whatever, theists would like to have God there as a plausible explanation, but they can't demonstrate that it's possible or that it's real, so they don't get to. Why doesn't God fix that? Why isn't, if God has put us in this position where you and I are reasonable people, and I don't find sufficient evidence, even though I used to, and I found flaws in those. Why is it that a Damascus Road experience is good enough for Paul or Saul, but everybody else has got to talk about mathematical possibilities messing with the constants of the universe, and even that doesn't get them to God or Jesus?
So I guess my argument for that would be, it's going to sound like a cop-out, but let me get through it completely, and hopefully it won't. I think in order to say that God should, appear physically to everyone like Paul's Damascus experience, I think you would need to show that given, let's say, Joe has an experience, he's an atheist, and he becomes saved. I think we would have to know what happened throughout the rest of Joe's life, all of the encounters he had from that point on. Maybe he met with some people and, prevented their salvation. So I don't know how Joe would do that, but I think we would have to have some kind of omniscience to know, okay, if this person were to become saved, it would ultimately be better for all of humanity, but I don't think we have any way of determining that.
I'll tell you why it's still a cop-out, because Blake has used this answer as well. The idea that we don't have sufficient understanding. Why can't God give us sufficient understanding?
I guess these are good questions. I guess it would be possible. I don't know. Our relationships may be hindered if we have too much insight into God's foreknowledge. I really don't know.
Can I ask a question?
That's a great question.
I just have a question, which is, you were leaning a lot, and this is not just like a criticism. I'm just going to kind of springboard off of this, but you were leaning a lot on the idea of if you look at all of this stuff, it kind of looks like a murder, right? Like what you're kind of were arguing was that it does sort of look like a murder, and so maybe we should look at who did the murder, right? That's kind of what it boiled down to, is that you felt like the when you look at it, these constants and things make you think that there may be an intelligent designer there somewhere, right? Is that pretty much correct? I'm not misrepresenting you. Okay, so when I look at the idea of what Matt is describing, and he's saying, if there's this God that really cares whether or not we understand that it exists and created the universe, why is he making it so incredibly difficult when he has reached out and made it very simple for some folks who, with Paul, I would say that if we're reading that story, God seems to have really cared whether or not Paul believed in him and did certain things, and God sent him this message like directly to kind of say, here's the deal, here's what I want from you. But for the rest of us that are having to look at all these things that you and Matt are talking about, as far as like, okay, so I have to go up and read some physics, and I have to go, and if it's that difficult to demonstrate that a God exists or that a God was involved in creating the universe, doesn't that seem to point to the idea that the God doesn't really care if we connect it to the universe or if we know that it's there? Well, maybe they care. Maybe it cares about Paul knowing, but it doesn't seem to care if I know, because it's making it real hard for me to understand. A lot of people aren't even going to understand what you and Matt are discussing, and so this is putting it outside of the range of most normal people that are just going about their daily business.
Sure, and I guess I wouldn't say that. Like, I think the fine-tuning argument is absolutely necessary. I think God has reasons for putting certain people in certain situations where they'll come to believe for different reasons. I think it's important for people to try and understand why they believe, but I think like the fine-tuning argument specifically only gets you to kind of like a deistic type creator. But I think that's a necessary step along the way if you're trying to establish that Christianity is true. But to your point about
is it actually a necessary
God
step?
made it
Is it actually a necessary step? If Jesus were just to appear right in front of me, I would have skipped the step about deism, right?
Right, but
And why do you think that God has reasons for treating people differently?
Well, but even if God has reasons for treating people differently, then wouldn't it just make sense to say that if a person went through, and I know that just making sense doesn't make it, right real or anything, but what I'm saying is, if somebody goes throughout their life and they never believe that a God exists, It seems that God didn't really care if that person believed or not. That's not one of the people that he was focused on as far as this person needs to understand and believe in me. It seems like if God wants you to do that, and if you're saying that he drives you in certain situations in order to sort of help push you along in that direction, that all the people that don't get pushed in that direction, then it makes sense to assume that God is not worried about whether or not they believe.
Well, I think it's possible that God could have some good reason for allowing unbelievers to exist.
Why not?
Maybe that person. Yeah, well, maybe that person doesn't personally have an interest in examining the evidence for God's existence, but maybe.
What about people like Matt that examine, and they don't find it compelling?
Yeah, why doesn't Matt find it?
Well, I'm not even saying why doesn't he find it compelling. What I'm saying is the fact that he doesn't find it compelling. Then, if I believe that God has this plan for each person that's individual, it seems that the plan for Matt is that he would look at the evidence, not find it compelling, and become an atheist.
So what was the question?
It's not so much a question as, does it then seem, if God has this plan where he gives people the prompts that they need in order to find him in different ways, that the people who never find God, then he's not really worried about whether or not they find him. Okay,
so you're saying if people are examining and they don't find God, then God is doing something wrong. God should have. No,
I'm not saying God's doing something wrong. I'm saying that it seems that he doesn't. If he cares about a person believing and then he puts them in a certain direction,
he should be more concerned.
No, I don't. I'm saying that apparently,
you're not
apparently apparently his plan for the atheists is that they just are going to not believe, and that's okay.
And I guess that would go back to my point. Maybe he has some good reason for allowing unbelief. Maybe so that Matt can have interesting debates, but I don't know.
My problem here is, and you've done this, and Blake has done this, and that's why I asked the question a minute ago. You think God's got a good reason, or maybe it's possible that God has a good reason. All of those are built on a foundation that you're convinced there's a God and that he knows and has plans and has a better understanding of things that we do. And you're fine with the idea that even though it doesn't make sense to you, you trust that it makes sense to God. And what I don't understand is, how can anybody be comfortable with that? The idea that, that's a really difficult question, and it doesn't seem to make sense with what we know and understanding about reality, but I'm just going to trust that God has a good explanation that he's not willing to share with us. How is that anything other than blind faith? And couldn't you use that same excuse to justify any position and any religion?
I think you could if you didn't have any kind of underlying foundation. So for Christians, the foundation for belief is the resurrection. That's what Christianity stands or falls on. So, but if we have good reasons for thinking that Jesus actually rose from the dead,
but you
then
don't.
All these questions about, I'm sorry.
Well, first of all, I would argue that you don't. I've debated Mike Lacona on this as well.
That would be a long conversation.
But let's assume for a second that we had really good reason to believe that Jesus died, was buried, and came back to life. How did it happen? What's the explanation for how it happened?
Well, I think you would, if you're kind of hinting at maybe aliens did it, or maybe there's some other mechanism.
I'm not hinting at anything. I'm asking, how do we go about determining what the most probable explanation is? And how could we ever say that a miracle from a God that we haven't demonstrated this whole thing Tracy talked about, you found a murder. What theists are doing is claiming a murder when we have no evidence that a murder has ever occurred or that a murder is even possible.
Okay.
So if we've never had a murder,
no priors.
This is basically like one person on a planet alone is found dead, and somebody wants to conclude it's a murder just because a suicide seems unlikely. If we got an instance where there's no demonstration, technically we wouldn't even know what murder was.
Right. So the idea of a higher power, we don't have examples of that. So you're saying it's not like a reasonable explanation, right?
Yeah, you don't get to just posit an explanation. You need to demonstrate that your explanation is in fact one of the possibilities. And you can't do that by just saying, oh, it's not impossible. And yet somehow you get to this, oh, well, if we had a good foundation, like the resurrection, but then my answer is, why on earth would, even if we agreed that Jesus rose from the dead, we don't have an explanation for how. You don't get to just say that, oh, it happened, and that's consistent with my God beliefs, and therefore that adds credence to my trust in God. And it's worse than that, because we don't have good reason to think that Jesus actually died and was resurrected.
So, I mean, I would take into consideration, I mean, I know you don't think there's good evidence for the resurrection, but if there was, I think we would also have to consider Jesus' own divinity claims. I mean, it wouldn't just be some guy being raised from the dead. It would be.
I guess my question there would be: there's a lot of things that we're assuming if we go these routes. Like, first of all, we're assuming that if an intelligent designer existed, this would be the kind of universe it would want to create. And I don't know that, especially if we're saying that that designer is so beyond us that we can't even conceive of it, or can't even understand it, or understand its motives or reasoning. Then how can we possibly say this is the universe it would make? And then when it comes to the idea of a resurrection, how do we know that a divinity, that resurrecting someone from the dead is something a divinity would even care about or want to do? Like, how can we make these predictions?
And I don't know that if in fact we lived in a universe where there was a God who came down in human form in some sense and had a bad weekend and then resurrected himself, I don't know how we could conclude that that is a reasonable, intelligent, or good God. When you add in the idea of this bloodlust and substitutionary atonement and the absurdity of coming down and being a sacrifice to serve as a loophole for rules he made up, I don't know how any of that gets us to this idea that, oh, well, of course that's a good God. A conversation that took place this weekend, and I think I'd probably have to wrap it up after this. Somebody approached me with this idea of people who were traumatized as children because they were told that you are so bad, God had to kill his own son for you. Now, for me, it was very different. I walked down the aisle at a revival at around the age of 5. I was active in a Southern Baptist church, and my perspective was, this was not, you were so bad somebody had to die for you. It was, you were so loved that there was a willing sacrifice for you. So there's two ways of looking at this thing. But I'm finding that the idea that you were so bad that somebody had to be killed, at least for a weekend, is perhaps a more accurate. Because if it were all about you being loved, then you could be forgiven without the weird bloodlust. What is it about the blood magic that I know the words? Oh, well, Jesus was pure and perfect, and then we required a perfect sacrifice, the one sacrificial lamb that was blemish-free to serve and absorb for all of our sins. I know the words. How does that possibly make sense if I'm God, that I have a creation that I know is imperfect, and I want to forgive them because they're never going to be worthy on their own. And so my best plan is to take human form and have myself tortured and killed for a weekend and raise myself up and then make the future of people's salvation contingent upon whether or not they accept this, when the only record is written down in ancient languages that change and morph, where the stories conflict such that a mere 2,000 years later, nobody could have a reasonably warranted belief that this actually occurred. At most, it would be a tenet of faith of, I am going to trust that these authors are accurately representing what happened. But we don't have evidence for it. How is that a good plan? And how is that even a good thing that I need to kill myself temporarily? I mean, none of that makes sense to me.
So, Tim Keller has kind of an argument for why the crucifixion was necessary that I thought was kind of interesting. I mean, it might not touch on like the sacrifice of life itself, but I mean, he says, if I break someone's lamp, I can either just forgive them and then go without the light, or they can give me the money for the replacement, or I can pay for it myself. But either way, there has to be some kind of payment for that. So I think God's sacrificing of Jesus demonstrates that sin is it's a real concern for him. It's not just something arbitrary that he can just kind of wave off. And I think if he were to just say, well, I don't really care what people do, I don't think that would be a very loving God, or he would have.
I care what people do. I don't ever feel a need to kill somebody based on what people do.
Right. So
I don't have kids, but I have family with kids. I don't ever feel the need to beat kids or threaten torture in a basement based on what they do. I think that it seems possible, and we can demonstrate that it happens, that you can encourage right behavior with reason. And even when it's difficult, there's nothing Tracy could do to me that would make me feel that I needed to kill someone to make up for it.
Or that I should die for it. I mean, what have I done in my life that I deserve
maybe
to
if
die?
she's coming at me with a knife in self-defense, I could potentially do something. But generally speaking, to just say, oh, and we'll do this one thing one time, and that'll make up for everything. That not only everything that has happened, but everything that will ever happen. I don't know. It's a system that never made sense to me, even when I believed it.
Right. Well, I mean, these are all great theological questions.
Why doesn't God answer any of these great theological questions? Are we just supposed to trust that he's got good reasons for not answering these questions?
Well, I mean, if you're asking, why did God feel the need to kill Jesus? I mean, I think the Bible has explanations for that. You just might not find it satisfying.
No, wait. There is no need when it comes to God, right? I mean, God is he bound by?
No, I'm not saying he has to do it in order to, just because he's God, but maybe.
So he had other options, right? I mean, he even had other options with regard to the universe he would have produced. He produced the universe to do what it does, right? I mean, everything that people do, he built the universe kind of saying, this is the one I want. I want Ted Bundy to rape and murder a 12-year-old, and I want Tracy to have a birthday cake when she turns 13, and I want Matt to marry Beth, and I want someone else. I want that one woman that murdered her children, drown them in the bathtub. I want her to do this. And so everything that people do, he had foreknowledge, I assume, when he produced the universe, and he chose that universe and said, this is the one I want. And then he blamed everybody for doing what he pretty much set it up so that they would do. Is that what I understand?
So, I mean, I agree that God had foreknowledge. And thank you guys so much.
Was it perfect?
And he had a choice, right? He had foreknowledge of what this universe would produce, and he chose to create that universe. Okay. So then he's responsible for what he produced, right? He knew what would happen and said, this is what I want to do.
Well, I mean, I don't think that seems to me like it would be kind of arguing, parents are guilty for if they have a kid and the kid misbehaves.
No,
parents don't have perfect foreknowledge.
Let's say that I knew I wanted to get pregnant, and I knew that if I had a child, it would go out and murder, it would become the next Hitler. And I said, I'm going to have this baby. And I know that this is going to happen. How am I not responsible for it? Don't I have a choice whether or not to have that child? Or let's say I could have a million different children, and I choose the one that's going to become the next Hitler. Aren't I responsible for that decision instead of choosing the one that would bring about world peace?
You can take the kid. You can take the kid out of it. If I get on my car in the freeway and I know, absolutely certain, even though I don't think we have absolute certainty about anything, but if I were in fact in possession of perfect foreknowledge, that when I got on the freeway, I was going to fly off of a ramp and smash into a building and kill 20 people, wouldn't I be responsible for that action? If I could not get in the car, but I chose to get in the car knowing what would happen, that makes me responsible.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are making good points. I guess I would say maybe God is like responsible for the existence of the creation, but not the sin within the creation.
Did he know what it would be before he created it or not?
Yeah, but
and could he choose other? Could he have chosen other universes with other outcomes?
Could he have chosen a universe where you were here holding my positions and I was there holding your positions?
Sure.
Then he chose this one.
Then he chose this particular universe.
And we didn't have choices. He put it into production and put it into play, and he knew what we were all going to do. He knew what Tracy would do from start to finish before she did it, and he chose for that Tracy.
Yeah, if he didn't make a choice, if this was the only universe he could create, then knowing what would happen doesn't make him responsible. But the triple threat of knowing what would happen, choosing this particular one,
having consequences,
and creating it, that's how you get to the responsibility. An action, knowing the outcome, that could have been different, means that he chose this universe. And he chose the one in which I'm destined for annihilation or hell, assuming, I don't change my mind. And he
then blamed us, said we should die for it, and then killed his own child / himself to atone for us.
It's really weird. And it's one of the reasons why, I'm writing a book on, called If I Were God, and it's one of the many questions that are in there, because the world that we live in does not make sense under any theistic God or notion. And that's why when we get into these conversations, quite often it's, well, I don't know, but I trust that God knows, which we've heard multiple times, heard a couple times today. And I don't know, that's certainly not good enough for me. I am troubled by why that's a good enough answer for somebody else, because I remember as a kid, whenever my parents would say, because I said so, that's never a satisfying answer, even if it turned out to be true. Even if my parents had really good knowledge and information and were doing what was in my best interest, it wasn't a satisfying answer. I obeyed because, generally, I'm not always, I wasn't perfect, because I had good reason to think that they knew best, and I definitely understood that I was going to get punished if I didn't. And yet I don't have any sort of confirmation like that about God. It's as if theists are telling me that my mom, who I've never met and don't know anything about, has been leaving notes for me with them, and they will give the notes to me, and it's all instructions for my mom, and it's all a bunch of stuff that I don't even have any way of assessing whether or not this is coming from my mom. It's weird. But on that note, we're running short of time. We've gone on for a long time. I appreciate the call, Brian.
Yeah, thank you.
And
yes, sir. Thank you all so much.
Sure. Have a good day.